Taxi drivers, what's the deepest secret you've overheard in your cab? Drove a cab for a while on weekends while in college. I had dated this girl for about a month when she confessed she had a boyfriend in Germany. She told me all about him and that he was going to be moving in with her. Stopped seeing her. A few months later I pick up a drunk couple at a bar. They are all over each other, making out in the back. The guy is German. We drop off the girl. Then he has me take him home. He starts telling me how he just moved here to be with his girlfriend, but she's out of town for the weekend. He says American girls are easy cause they're suckers for guys with accents and he cheats on his oblivious girlfriend all the time. Yep. It was the guy. I said nothing as I dropped him at Carrie's place. Always wondered what happened with them. Not a cab driver, but I am a very white guy that due to my military time can speak a fair amount of Urdu. I got to listen to my Pakistani cab driver in Vegas answer his phone and start talking about my newly wedded wife's tits. This man and wife got in my cab a while back. They were just talking lightly. And I'm fairly certain I heard "I still can't believe our son got you pregnant." I could tell the man was super pissed. I stopped listening after I heard that. To lawyers representing opposite sides in a divorce planning to prolong the proceedings. I'm assuming that means their fees are higher? Well, the total they will charge will go higher since they charge per hour. It's a common practice among lawyers to prolong cases and she just to charge more, but two lawyers on the opposite sides planning it. That's just crossing the line. I ordered a cab one night after I missed the bus home. After telling the driver where to go, he got a call. He apologized and closed the plexiglass window to take it privately. I guess the ceiling on it was off or something like that because I heard him very clearly say that he'd pick up his kilo in 20 minutes. He then opened the window, apologized again and asked me if I had seen the recent football game. At least he was a nice guy. Edit, just to clarify. This is Southern Florida. Odds are it was coke. Again. He was a pretty nice dude. I even slid him an extra 10 because he found a shortcut that shaved 15 minutes off of the trip. Short stint driving cab in Boston area. Two very attractive passengers come in. I assume they are a couple, even though the man is clearly far older than the woman. Talking loudly about getting away from Boston and going to Paris. I try to strike up some conversation and ask them how long they are going for. And they say they are moving there the next day. Turns out the dude was married. Like. To another woman. His wife was out for the night. And he was just packing up some stuff and moving without telling her. Or his 3 kids. Until he was there. Asked me if I could give them a ride to the airport in the morning. And I'd have to meet them around the block. I said no. I got no tip. Heh. I can't believe this is a question on Reddit and I actually have a good answer. John Corbett's Sheety Vanity Project band was in town and I picked the 4 of them up and brought them to the bars. All of them were talking about how they were itching for some college town pussy. Especially John. Corbett's been dating Bo Derek since 2002. Poor thing. Also, I saw his set the next day and they should spend less time getting wasted and cheating on their women and more time practicing how to play sing. My grandfather drove a taxi for a little while in the 1950s. Important to the story. He does an overnight shift and picks a woman up with a guy my grandfather thought was her husband. And drives them to her house. The next morning, Sunday, he picks the same woman up at her house with a different guy. They were on their way to church. He got a good tip on that one. My dad is a cab driver and so is my uncle. My dad has driven everything from drug dealers who have got pulled over and arrested in the vehicle to celebrities. My uncle once drove home 2 hot girls from the bar who began making out and were eating each other out by the time they got to their destination. They said they had no money. My uncle said no problem and went home. My dad drives around many former NHL players and current CFL players and genuinely enjoys his job. I work taking calls for a cab company. Not as a driver, but I had a fairly interesting call once. It was late at night and this girl was ordering her cab like this, so Oh. Yeah, could you? Yeah, ride like a cab too. Hey. Would you mind not licking my pussy when I'm talking to the taxi guy? Thanks. Well, sorry about that. Anyway. Goes on to complete the order. Maybe not much of a secret, except insofar the secret of what was going on was revealed. My best friend had a pretty rough relationship with a guy who got her pregnant and forced her to get an abortion. He was verbally abusive and always told her very nasty things. Then played the I love you card to get her to forgive him. He was on the phone with her one time when we were in a cab with another friend. And us being drunk, my friend and I just started reaming her out. Telling her the guy's trash. Doesn't deserve to be with him. Is mentally sick. etc. And the cab driver with this big shit-eating smile on his face started joining in, telling my friend to tell the guy to screw off and to give him the phone so he could put him in his place. Saying that he'd get his cousins to wreck his shit if he tries to do anything to hurt her. She ended up just hanging up and bursting into tears, and when we were at our destination the cab driver spent 10 or so minutes speaking to her to make her stop crying. We tipped him very well. Was in a cab and Nick with a Nigerian driver, and a fire engine with siren screaming came up behind us. This guy decided he had to get out of the way by driving faster than the fire engine. He was yelling at cars to move, weaving in and out of traffic. Cutting in the oncoming lane etc. Just going. I finally told him you could just pull over. This seemed like a totally new idea to him. He pulled over and the fire engine whizzed past. As a limo driver I heard an older, 55-ish, bachelorette party discussing the liberator pad and how it makes their husband's tiny big dick feel much larger. They were pretend moaning in the back while I had the divider down. I got my ass grabbed by one of the bridesmaids at the end of the night while she slipped me a C-note. Actual cab driver, posting from my cab on a slow night. At that, about a year and a half ago. I was driving some folks from the college town where I work to a much larger city about 40 minutes away, a surprisingly large fare. Anyway. Over the course of the trip it became clear that they had come into town to deal coke at the club I picked them up at. Part of their conversation was in Spanish. So I'm not super confident. But I think they sold about half a kilo that night. They paid me from a huge roll of mostly large bills. The leader of the group was also clearly high as hell and started to get really freaked out and insisted that I pull off the expressway to get some soda. I had an unopened Monster Energy in the cab. Handed it over. Ended up making almost 100% on the tip, one of the very best runs I've ever done. My girlfriend told me that she once got thrown out of a cab because the driver was so disgusted by the sexually explicit conversation she was having with her friends. I've driven cabs in Australia on and off for about 2 years. I think the worst story confession I got was from a dude who rushedly booked my cab to travel from one end of the Gold Coast, the city I live work in, to the other. He told me he was in such a hurry was because his girlfriend had just run him and told him she had been raped. She went to a party without him because they had been fighting. During the course of the ride he told me that he had been thinking of dumping her. But that with us he didn't know what to do. Dropped him off at her place and he was pretty messed up. Pretty bad situation to be in for both of them. Hope they managed to sort everything out. That the guy got his duck buddy pregnant. And that he couldn't sleep from seeing the kid's heartbeat the day before. We were on a midnight cookout run. It's a fast food chain. The summer of VA and NC. Also that a guy's life was exactly like Nick Cage's in Leaving Las Vegas. Confessed that his Filipino wife left him and took the kids years earlier and he was basically drinking himself dead. I've learned the best is to sit back and take it all in. I'm not a taxi driver. But I did give a drunk guy a ride to Holiday Inn Express last night. Sir. This is not a cab. Please get out. Take me to the nearest Holiday Inn. Okay. I had 3 girls spend the cab ride talking about the fake bobs of the middle one. Apparently the best place to get a bob job is Beverly Hills. They're cheap there. Because there's such competition for the business. And they are very good. Because they deal with a lot of volume. Not much of a secret. but I think this is his most appropriate thread for this story. My dad picked up some sketchy looking guy who was mumbling to himself for the whole ride and took him to his destination. A couple of days later my dad gets a call from the police saying that the guy he picked up murdered someone the night that my dad picked him up. He then had to testify against him in court as a witness. I don't know the outcome of the case though. It's funny that you ask this question because just last week, at around midnight, a guy in his 40s walked into my cab. He was extremely pissed because apparently a 22-year-old guy stole his job by taking his idea about some computer hardware. He kept on saying that this world has no future if people keep on stealing other people's hard drives. It's not the deepest secret, but it's mildly interesting stuff. I mean, he might have been the next Bill Gates. I was a dispatcher at a local cab company for a few years. We had been picking up a young woman and ferrying her from her house to her boyfriend's for a few months. Eventually, she stopped calling. In a town with cool cabs, we always kind of take that as a sign of a breakup and gossip about it over the radios and in the office. Then a couple months later, the news hits that her boyfriend had attempted to murder her. And not just murder her, she was beaten savagely, stabbed repeatedly in her genitals, and shoved into his trunk. She survived and was rescued. But only just. The picture painted of this man was a weird one. He traveled alone a lot in Israel and Russia, immersed himself in martial arts and weapons training, and had an incredibly shallow affect. I believe they had just broken up. She started seeing someone else, and he hunted her down. We always worried about regulars after that, sometimes calling the ones who dropped off the radar. The darkly poetic element to all of this was his last name, Jaeger, which means hunter in German. A few months ago, I was called to pick up a 20-something man at the local prison. He had been pulled over for DUI and had cooperated with the police during the sobriety tests. Unfortunately, he'd failed pretty much all of them. When the police asked that he take a blood test, he flat out refused. This did not sit particularly well with the police, and he was arrested, taken to jail, and had his driver's license suspended. The police needed me to take him home, which was 3 towns away. During the 35-mile trip, he made some phone calls, which I got to listen in on, to grandma, without a license. He could no longer afford to keep his apartment, and so would be moving back in with her. To mom, the lucrative government job offer that he'd just received had a valid driver's license required clause. To his friend, the only reason that he'd cooperated with the police at the start was so that they wouldn't search his, currently impounded, car and find all of the drugs. Also got to hear, several times, that the sobriety tests weren't fair because the line they'd asked him to walk was on a slight hill. Also, it was cold and he was shivering, which naturally affected his balance. He figured that a lawyer could get him his license back. I wished him good luck. The "your case doesn't stand a snowball's chance" part was left unsaid. He did not leave a tip. This is only semi-relevant, but I picked up a guy once who started talking about a night he recently had out of town, and met some hot bartender or something. It was a very awkward conversation because it seemed like there were a lot of weird pauses whenever I would reply, and a lot of his responses to what I said didn't quite make sense. After a solid 15 minutes of this, I realized he was talking to a friend via a Bluetooth headset. I've never felt so dumb. Each night when I return the cab to the garage, I have to clean the cum off the back seat. Some nights, I clean off the blood. Whenever I see posts like this, I want to have fake conversations in a cab and see how long it is before I bump into a Redditor cab driver who'll post it on Reddit. It has to be something that won't get me in jail, so maybe I should come up with story about getting a dildo stuck up my ass during a les orgy or casting people for furry porn. I heard this from a cab driver in Miami once. Mexicans need to realize that a lot of white people in the States know Spanish and maybe shouldn't talk about their driver like that. Not really a secret, and I wasn't the driver. But when I was in San Fran, I had a crazy ducking taxi driver. He spent the entire ride speeding and calling all the pedestrians assholes and dildos. My boyfriend and I were terrified. He also talked about how much he wanted to go out at night and carry weapons and save people if they were getting robbed. Super nice of him, right? Except that he said if they didn't pay him for helping them, he would beat them up. WTF. Edit. The man was an older guy with long gross brown grey hair. He has a manic laugh and will beep the horn repeatedly at people. To get him to not heal you, talk about metalocalypse. If you ever get the guy, I pretty much saved your life. I picked up an older gentleman from a local discreet all-male brothel. He was articulate, sweet, funny, and also male prostitute. He was on his way to see his mother at the nursing home. He told me his mother does not know what he does and thinks he is just a teacher. He wants to quit working in the brothel but he cannot afford to keep his house and pay for his mother's care on teaching wages. He was very forthcoming with all this and became a regular client. He tipped very well also. Nick taxi driver told me his deep secret one night. He'd picked me up after I'd finished working a long bar shift and had enjoyed an even longer after party. I don't know if my level of drunkenness made me come across as trustingly friendly or blackout forgetful, but it was a long drive to where I lived in Harlem. So we started telling stories. He looked like a caricature of a Mexican guy, stocky, tan, mustachioed, etc. We even spoke a bit in Spanish, but his accent was very unique. This was due to the fact that he'd moved to Mexico from Pakistan, his native country, and had posed as a Mexican to sneak into America via the usual over-the-border routes. He'd done this after 9/11. Fearing America would bomb the hell out of his homeland in their search for terrorists. He had to disguise his true origins to make himself a more acceptable illegal alien. And the plan worked perfectly. His wife and daughter followed soon after. The taxi job he'd worked so hard to excel at was now supporting the family and paying his daughter's way through college. Unfortunately, once he'd gotten to America, his old job required too many credentials to allow him to remain laying low in his new life. Back home, he'd been a biochemist. Actual cabbie in a college town. Closest I have is when I picked up a bunch of guys from the Doucher East frat in town. They were all talking about how one of them was the man for his sexual exploits that night. I like money, so I played into it. As the story progresses, I come to find out he is being praised for molesting some girl that passed out at the party. I dropped them, collected the fair and generous tip. Then I told the guy flat out that he is a rapist, and that I hope he ends up in prison with a ruined life. They went from drunken laughter and high fives straight to slack jawed shock. I drove away with their money. Out of college I drove cab for a summer. And one night I was driving a older couple to the airport. Turns out the wife was flying out, the husband was staying. The husband was a older gentleman in a nice suit. After he said his goodbyes he had me drive across town where we picked up a much younger man, who I originally took to be his son. That is until they started making out in the backseat. They had me take them to a club. Gave me a nice tip, which helped alleviate the mind duck I got that night.